I think there's some very interesting themes before us. It might seem like this passage is a little bit out of place, coming in at an interesting time. And so I think it's important that we understand how this came about in the book of Mark. Now the story is told both in the Gospel of Matthew and Luke as well, but Mark has it a little bit differently in this kind of literary sense, and he actually gives us the most detail out of the other, or in comparison to the other Gospels. So John the Baptist, we may remember, comes to us back in chapter 1 of the book of Mark when we're told that his goal of preparing the way for the Lord. Chapter 1, verses 4 through 8, give us this picture of this wild man in the wilderness baptizing people. And then we're told of his arrest in chapter 1, verse 14. And nothing much more is said about him until we get to this point. And so in the last few weeks, along with the readers of this gospel and the characters in the book of Mark, are really coming to know and get a really clear picture of who Jesus is. We're getting these instances of miracles, actions of healing, his teachings and parables up to last week in our Easter message, with his sending out mission-oriented goals for the disciples. And so we get this passage here in the beginning of John in the midst of these stories of mission, and the growing success of the disciples and the growing message and knowledge of Jesus's name. And then it's also followed by these issues of Jesus actually becoming so popular that the crowds are becoming an issue for them. His traveling, his work and logistics, it's just becoming a lot for them to handle. So for today in this passage, I think a couple things that we'll work through is drawing out a deeper understanding of what this passage is in respect to its setting in the entire book of Mark, and why we have it in this spot, but also a few themes in regard to what we do when our power and authority are questioned, and also how it feeds into our courage and what that means for us as disciples. So this passage does seem a little bit out of place, as I mentioned, and it's a bit of a curveball right here. We kind of get this right after a message of success and mission, and Jesus and his disciples are completely absent from this scene, aside from that gossip that we get in those first few verses. But it also serves as a bit of a counterpoint to what we talked about last week in our Easter message. And one of those ideas was how familiarity actually breeds contempt. Now, this week, this passage might point to how unfamiliarity can breed fear and violence. So Jesus' reputation has no doubt been growing in popularity, to the point that it's reached the court and ears of King Herod. Verses 14 through 16 give us this idea of how this information is actually coming to him. People are worried that it's John coming back, raised from the dead with these supernatural powers, or Elijah, another prophet, something like that. All these speculations are really swirling around Herod, and he's feeling a bit threatened by it. I think that's a correct assumption to make. Actually, so much so that it triggers this flashback, which takes place in verses 17 through 29, as he's remembering when he did this thing to John. So verse 17 brings us back to that setting of John's arrest, and Herod acknowledges that he was actually responsible for that arrest. And Mark, as an author, grants that one of the reasons is because John was speaking out against Herod taking his brother's wife as his own. Now, interestingly, this starts to set up a dynamic between three characters of John, Herod, and his wife, Herodias. Herodias clearly hates John because of his speaking out against her and her new marriage to this man of power. But Herod occupies this really interesting middle space between there. He's still obviously perplexed and intrigued by John and the things he has to say. He recognizes his faith and openly admits that he is a righteous and holy man. So Herod actually works to protect John. So clearly this has kind of bothered Herodias. It's against his wife's wishes, but he does it anyways. And there's some tension present. So when the opportunity actually does arise during that banquet, where Herod is celebrating his power and putting it on display for his court and Herodias to see, Herodias and her daughter leap on this opportunity to take advantage of the question that Herod asks. So I think it's important that we understand who Herod is as a king, where the title of king isn't actually entirely correct for what he is. He's more like a third or fourth kind of tertiary power in a sense, where he's really still struggling for relevance within the greater kingdom at large. So much so that actually down the line in Herod's career, he's actually removed from power because of his ambition. So after this, we get this after the dance of Herodias, he's greatly excited. Verse 22 through 23 tell us, when his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests, and the king said to the girl, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom." So when Herod's making this claim, it's less about his actual willingness to hand over half of the kingdom, but more of an emphasis to say that I am this powerful man. Let me give you something to show that in front of all these people. It's a prideful statement that he's really using to show off. Unfortunately, that ask comes to be about the head of John the Baptizer. And we come to verse 26, which marks his grievance towards what is actually asked of him. He knows this is not something that he should do, but he does it anyways. Because he knows his reputation and relationships are on the line. He's in court with a lot of powerful people. And so he gives in and hands John over. And the rest is there for us to see as John's head is literally presented on a platter. So I hear this story, and I think I've mentioned to you all before that I do have an affinity for literature, and I couldn't help but think about the story of one of Edgar Allan Poe's stories, The Telltale Heart. Now it's a bit darker theme, but I think bear with me and it might make a little more sense here. So for this flashback that Herod gets after hearing these rumors of Jesus, his guilt really starts to become overwhelming because he knows that he did something wrong by beheading John. And so for those of you who don't know about The Telltale Heart, it's this story also that pairs a fascination with annoyance, kind of this tension that is present between those two things. And eventually, the narrator of this story ends up killing this man with this milky eye that he's kind of comes out of this nightmare and reacts poorly. And so panicking after that, he dismembers the man, buries him underneath his own floorboards. And then, of course, the police come in and investigate. And during that investigation, the narrator starts to feel really uncomfortable. There's this ringing in his ears. And as this ringing grows louder and louder, he basically concludes that that's got to be this guy's heartbeat that's underneath my floorboards. And the sound steadily starts increasing more and more. And even though the officers don't seem to hear anything, the narrator is just convinced they must hear this. And so this violent beating of the heart is kind of just building up over time. And as his own guilt just builds up, he finally explodes and breaks down and confesses to the murder and tells them to tear up the floorboards and reveal the body. So I know that's a pretty dark story, but I can't help but picture Herod sitting there in this and hearing these rumors and prestige of Jesus, triggering this flashback and that guilt starting to build up and overwhelm him because he knew he did something wrong. Because it was a choice that that Herod made out of fear and kind of a cowardice and unwillingness to stick to his own conviction rather than listen to those in his court. I think it also points to the fact that Herod hasn't seen Jesus for himself. He's sitting in his own safety, cut off from the public, cut off from the world, and taking other people's words and rumors about it and kind of surmising his own conclusion from that. And I say all this because I think that the character of Herod can actually teach us a lot of what it means to know Jesus. So one of our first questions or themes for today might start to become a little bit more clear is, what do we do when our power and authority are questioned or actually put on the line? So for Herod, his first reaction was, of course, to throw John into jail. John was sent there for his willingness to point out something that he saw as wrong. He was standing up and resisting Herod. And Herod's attempt was for the sake of controlling this voice of power and holiness to a point that it would no longer draw that public shame and guilt for being called out on his actions. But we're also told of Herod's respect for John. So Herod doesn't kill him. He really just keeps him in jail. So Herod as a character, I think, strikes us as one that's stuck in limbo. He doesn't really know what decision to make. And this is a fact that's further emphasized when he finally faces the decision in the end to meet the daughter Herodias's demand and chooses his own power over that what he appears to know as John's and righteousness of faith. So his grievance is no doubt telling of his character's inability to be what he actually respected in John himself. Now, all this goes to say that I think many of us become Herod more often than we would like to admit. I know, for one, it's really easy for me to arrest my faith and put it in a cell in order that I won't feel condemned by it or controlled by it more than I want to control my faith. What's more, I ask myself what happens when our faith or our convictions are questioned in front of others. So Herod's story seems to direct us to understand our fear for that question. When we're facing our fears about God that we can't control, a God who's going to tell you the things that you don't like, a God who's going to speak to you in parables, that's going to perplex you and intrigue you, might even condemn you at times. It points to a life outside of political power and kingdoms that we find ourselves occupying. Out of the banquet of the courts of rulers and into a banquet of the wilderness. Now, I say that because this passage is actually followed by Jesus feeding the 5,000 in the wilderness. And Jesus does this not for the sake of showing off, but in order that those people can stay, hear the word, and actually be transformed and fed. So we're getting this juxtaposition of the banquet of the royal serving very few people and actually killing someone, and then the banquet of the wilderness serving many. So the choice that Herod actually had here was to cling to what he knows about power and what he knows about authority in order that he keep his court happy. So the question continues to be for us, when our power and authority are questioned, are we clinging to what we know rather than allowing ourselves to be changed and transformed by a holy and righteous word? So there are two biblical texts that I think we can draw our attention to while we start to get some better understanding for what's going on here. So both of these, we have the prophet Elijah, which is actually mentioned in this verse, and then a second one is Esther. I think they're relevant stories to this. So a quick summary of those. Elijah, back in 1 Kings, found himself in much the same situation as John. He called out King Ahab on his marriage to Jezebel, who hated him for killing the prophets of Baal. Therefore, Jezebel hated Elijah and all the prophets and priests of God, so much so that they actually went into hiding. And God ended up cursing the land and caused a drought. Now, fortunately, Elijah was given the chance to prove God's power over the Baals and broke the drought for the land. And it kind of ends that way. But the second is Esther. And great book of the Bible, and this is by no means doing that story justice, but Esther's a woman who recognized the evil in the plan of King Xerxes' right-hand man Haman. His plan was to wipe out the Jews because Esther's uncle Mordecai refused to pay Haman respect and kind of command. But Esther found herself in the receiving end of the same exact question that Herod asked Herodias' daughter. Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half my kingdom. Now, she uses her ability to answer that to save her uncle and ultimately the Jews, and is widely celebrated for it. There was a holiday that was marked after that. Now, those two quick summaries don't do justice to the full stories, as I mentioned, but I think that those stories impact us in the way that we understand our ability to speak up out in resistance to powers as Christians. And I think it's telling that both of us, the risk that we are willing to take and how that informs our courage as disciples. And I think that that is key to part of our mission as disciples as well. So as I noted earlier, this passage is located in context with Jesus actually sending out his disciples. It's kind of a break in that story to more or less pass the time on mission to spread the word. But I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that John's beheading is a really key part in understanding what our missions as disciples of Christ are. So we discussed one of the overarching themes in the book of Mark is about the relationship of Jesus with his disciples. Their character is one that's constantly coming into question as their faith is confronted by the teachings and sayings of Jesus and his actions. And he has some really harsh questions for them. And this passage really does serve to emphasize that further. So the backdrop of this passage is this story that begins and ends with John's arrest and then his death. As we get to this, it's addressed finally in verse 29. When John's disciples heard about his death, they came and take his body and lay it in a tomb. Now, pointing to this, we see some parallels drawn in his death and the death of Jesus on the cross. An important note, too, when we acknowledge that John is the more or less forerunner, a title that we give to John for Jesus, is one that is preparing the path for the Lord. He meets a similar end for his faith as Christ does. John's death really sets the stage for what is to come down the road. Now, us as readers, we see this, and we should probably start to pick up on some themes that come out of that. Because like John, Jesus is also held by a man who believed him innocent. Jesus was held by Pontius Pilate, yet Pilate is also swayed by the demand of the crowd and gives in and gives him up to death. So the cross and that theme is once again paired with an understanding of what our discipleship could and should look like. So my hope in this and kind of drawing that out is to become clear and understand how our courage should inform the way that we understand our discipleship. Now, courage is really easy when there's nothing on the line and there's nothing to be feared. But in the model of John and Christ, they knew what it meant to lay down even their lives for the service and glory of God. Same with Elijah and Esther. They were willing to take that risk. And it's not an effort to praise ourselves or lift ourselves up, but it's one to glorify God. Now, I think this looks a lot different for all of us as, of course, we find ourselves in different contexts and situations. There are systems and power that right now are easier to point to than others and be up and speak out against them. Right now, my heart is with my Asian brothers and sisters and bearing and knowing what the anti-Asian sentiment is like and what the power that has taken up in the people in our communities. And it's like a sickness. It really is. And I think that's something that we can point to and try to speak out against when we see it and hear it. Or maybe it's something internal within our own lives that we hold on to with a lot of pride. Now, I think that was ultimately Herod's problem, is he had a lot of pride in the power that he had as a leader and a king. So maybe that's an addiction, a grudge, or something that we need to understand or hate and forgive and understand what it means to sacrifice and actually lose those things. So it's confronting our willingness to change and admit that we're lacking and need Jesus in our lives rather than trying to find a way to keep him at a distance and put him in a cell. It's not making the effort to know Jesus for ourselves and simply listening to others just tell us about him, listening to those rumors, listening to those fabrications that come up. Now, I've seen myself what that can do and what kind of damage that can form. The looking at the history of churches and kind of how some people grow up in their faiths. I think it's a pretty commonplace thing that you'll hear a lot today is understanding like a childlike faith as one that doesn't grow up with an acknowledgement to how to apply Jesus to the modern day world. We get this kind of old version that works for kind of a youthful vision, but not something that actually works for our adult lives. And many people actually lose their faith because of that. Now, I've also seen what the drive for stability looks like, and in an unwillingness to actually look and be transformed by the word. And as we build our lives and our careers around things, it can be increasingly difficult to integrate our faith into that world and develop a language around it. And the drive for stability and security can actually take away from our courage to live a Christ-like life. And so as we look at the desires and powers within the world and acknowledge that it's okay to lose those things and let go of them in the name of Christ. So to allow ourselves to grow into a stronger faith and discipleship, it means knowing what it is to sacrifice in the name of service really does mean. So I believe that if we focus on spreading the love of Christ, those things actually do start to make a whole lot more sense and become easier to see. So, Lord, may we have eyes to see and ears to hear. Now, finally, as Christians, I think we have a lot of reason for courage. And that reason is rooted in what we saw last week in Easter, in the resurrection. That's where we can place our hope and our faith in God. God's bigger than this, bigger than things we face every day. And this draws us into acknowledging that his power and his glory are that what we focus on, rather than those things of the world that draw us and take us away from the glory that is present in the kingdom. And so for us, I'd like to take away in understanding those moments when we try to show off our own power rather than God's power. In those moments where we try to put Jesus in a box, or those moments where we refuse to acknowledge Jesus for ourselves in our own person, and allow those things to overcome what God is really trying to take into our lives and work on for us and in ourselves, in our souls, and the way that we transform one another in community. So I'll go ahead and pray for us. Dear Lord, I thank you for bringing us all here today. I pray that your word sits with us, penetrates our hearts, our minds, and our bodies, and allows us to see your glory and allow us to be reflections of your glory in other people's lives, in our own lives, and those that we come into contact with. I pray that during this season, the season of spring and acknowledgement of Easter, that we see your restoration, that we see your hope and your healing shine through and be present for all of us. Lord, I pray that your glory comes to the forefront of our minds and our eyes as we look out and see the world and the powers and the pain and the hurts of others. Allow us to step in and be your ambassadors, to be your disciples, and to be representatives to the world of your glory and your power. Amen.